Listen, when you stop reaching out to a man, you don't just stop sending messages. You interrupt a pattern he had become comfortable with, and suddenly the woman he thought would always be there is no longer there in the same way. That's when his mind starts asking questions his ego never wanted him to ask. Where does she go? Why isn't she calling? Does she still care? Did I finally lose her? And sometimes your silence says more than every message you ever sent. Because there comes a moment in every woman's life when she gets tired. Not necessarily tired of loving him, but tired of being the only one trying to keep the connection alive. Tired of wondering why the conversation always has to be started by her. Tired of checking her phone, rereading old messages, making excuses for his distance, and convincing herself that if she just gives him a little more time, a little more understanding, a little more love, somehow everything will become clear. But love was never supposed to feel like begging someone to notice your absence. And that's where something powerful begins. The moment you stop reaching out, you give reality room to speak. For a while, you may feel like you're doing something wrong. You may pick up your phone and instinctively open his conversation. You may type something and delete it. You may wonder whether he's waiting for you. You may tell yourself, maybe I should just check on him. Maybe he thinks I'm angry. Maybe he needs me. Maybe if I don't reach out, he'll forget about me. But let me tell you something. If a connection disappears simply because you stopped carrying it, then you didn't destroy the connection. You discovered who was carrying it. And that discovery can hurt. Because when you've been emotionally invested in someone, silence doesn't immediately feel like freedom. At first, silence can feel like rejection. It can feel like punishment. It can feel like you're losing the person you're trying so hard not to lose. But healing begins when you understand that silence is not always about losing someone. Sometimes silence is how you find yourself again. And while you're sitting there wondering what is happening in his mind, something very interesting may be happening inside him too. When a man becomes accustomed to your attention, he can start treating your presence as part of the background of his life. Your good morning text, your check-ins, your questions, your concern, your emotional availability, your willingness to forgive, your habit of being the one who reaches out after an argument. He may not consciously think, she'll always chase me. But his behavior can begin operating as if he believes it. That's why your absence can create a psychological interruption. Suddenly, the pattern changes. He sends nothing, and nothing comes from you. He waits, still nothing. He checks his phone, still nothing. He may tell himself he doesn't care, but then a thought appears. Why hasn't she reached out? And that question can become louder than he expected. Now, don't misunderstand this. The purpose of pulling back is not to manipulate a man into chasing you. That's not self-respect. That's another form of emotional dependence. You don't stop reaching out because you want to make him suffer. You stop because you realize you shouldn't have to convince someone to participate in your life. There's a massive difference between using silence as a weapon and using distance as a boundary. A weapon says, I'm going to ignore you so you panic. A boundary says, I'm no longer going to chase something that isn't meeting me halfway. One comes from fear, the other comes from self-worth. And when you reach that second place, something inside you changes. You stop asking, how do I make him miss me? And you start asking, why was I so comfortable accepting so little? That's a much deeper question, because sometimes the hardest person to detach from isn't the man himself. It's the version of the future you imagined with him. You weren't only attached to his texts, you were attached to what you hoped those texts would eventually become. You weren't only attached to his attention, you were attached to the possibility that one day he would finally give you the consistency you deserved. You weren't only waiting for him, you were waiting for the relationship you believed was hiding somewhere inside him. And that can keep a person emotionally trapped for months or even years. But when you stop reaching out, the fantasy begins separating from reality. And that's when you begin seeing him differently. You start noticing the difference between what he said and what he did. You start recognizing the difference between chemistry and compatibility. You start understanding that missing someone doesn't automatically mean you should return to them. You start realizing that love without consistency creates confusion. And confusion, when repeated long enough, becomes emotional exhaustion. Now think about what happens from his side. If he genuinely cared about you but had become emotionally passive, your silence may force him to confront his own behavior. He may start replaying conversations. He may remember moments when you were always available. He may realize that he hasn't heard your voice in days. He may remember the little things you used to do that he never properly appreciated. And this is something human beings often don't understand until it's gone. We can become accustomed to comfort. We can become so familiar with someone's presence that we stop noticing its value. The person who always answers becomes the person we assume will answer. The person who always forgives becomes the person we assume will forgive again. The person who always reaches out becomes the person we assume will eventually reach out, until one day she doesn't. And now his mind has to deal with a new reality. Maybe she's actually done. Maybe she has moved on. Maybe she finally understands what I've been doing. Maybe I pushed too far. Maybe she isn't waiting anymore. And that's where the silence becomes powerful. Not because it forces him to love you, but because it forces him to reveal himself. A man who truly values you may recognize your absence and decide to step forward. A man who only valued your attention may miss the attention, but make no meaningful effort. And those two things are completely different. Someone can miss your messages without missing you. Someone can miss your availability without being ready to love you properly. Someone can miss the emotional comfort you provided without being willing to provide emotional security in return. That's why you cannot measure love by whether he comes back. You measure it by how he comes back. Does he return with accountability? Does he communicate clearly? Does he acknowledge what happened? Does he make an effort? Does he show consistency? Does he respect the boundary you created? Or does he simply send a random hey at midnight because he's lonely? That's the difference between someone who wants access to you and someone who wants a relationship with you. And you have to learn that difference. Because one of the most painful mistakes a woman can make is confusing someone's return with someone's transformation. He can come back and still be the same person. He can miss you and still not know how to love you. He can regret losing you and still not have the emotional maturity to build something healthy with you. And this is where your emotional intelligence becomes more important than your emotions. Your emotions may scream, "He came back!" Your wisdom needs to ask, what has actually changed? Your heart may say, "He missed me." Your boundaries need to ask, can he consistently treat me better? Your loneliness may say, give him another chance. Your self-respect needs to ask, a chance for what? Because you don't need another chapter if it's just the same chapter with different words. And sometimes when you stop reaching out, he begins thinking about you more because your attention is no longer guaranteed. But here's the beautiful part. You begin thinking about him less. That's the transformation nobody talks about. At first, you're waiting for him to notice your silence. Then eventually, you notice your own silence. You notice how peaceful your phone feels when you're no longer checking it every 5 minutes. You notice how much energy you have when you're not trying to decode every message. You notice how much time you have when you're not wondering where you stand. You start sleeping better. You start laughing again. You start doing things because you enjoy them, not because you're trying to distract yourself from him. And one day you realize something incredible. You don't need him to text you anymore. You don't need an apology to validate your pain. You don't need him to regret losing you in order to know that you were valuable. You don't need his realization to confirm your worth. And that's when you've actually begun to heal. Because healing isn't when you stop loving someone overnight. Healing is when loving them no longer requires abandoning yourself. Let that sink in. You can still care about someone and choose distance. You can still remember the beautiful moments and accept that the relationship wasn't healthy for you. You can still wish someone well without inviting them back into your life. You can forgive someone without giving them another opportunity to hurt you. And you can miss someone without contacting them. That's emotional maturity. There's a strange period after you stop reaching out where your mind will try to bargain with you. It will say, just send one message. Just one. Hey, how have you been? And then you'll tell yourself that you're not chasing. You're just checking in. But deep down, you know what you're really hoping for. You're hoping that message opens a door. You're hoping he responds differently this time. You're hoping he suddenly becomes the man you've been waiting for. And sometimes that's where you have to be brutally honest with yourself. Are you reaching out because you genuinely want healthy communication? Or are you reaching out because you're uncomfortable with being forgotten? Those are not the same thing. Fear of being forgotten can make you chase people who already showed you they weren't choosing you. But self-worth says, I don't need to remind someone of my value. If he has to be constantly reminded that you exist before he recognizes your importance, that's not the kind of recognition you should build your life around. And here's another thing you need to understand. Silence doesn't always mean he's thinking about you. Sometimes it simply means he's comfortable with the distance. And you have to be emotionally strong enough to accept that possibility. Because your goal isn't to create a reaction. Your goal is to discover the truth. If he reaches out because he genuinely wants to repair things, you learn something. If he doesn't reach out at all, you learn something too. Either way, you receive information. And information is powerful when you stop fighting it. The woman who constantly reaches out can remain trapped in uncertainty. Does he care? Does he miss me? Is he busy? Is he scared? Is he with someone else? Should I wait? But when you step back, you stop trying to solve the mystery and start watching the behavior. And behavior tells you what words sometimes hide. A person who wants to be in your life will eventually have to participate in your life. Not perfectly, not without mistakes, but intentionally. You shouldn't have to build the entire bridge and then wonder why he's standing on the other side. Love requires two people walking toward each other. And if you're always walking while he's always watching, eventually you have to stop. Not to punish him, to save yourself. Because there is a quiet kind of heartbreak that comes from constantly overgiving. You smile. You say you're fine. You understand his situation. You excuse his behavior. You tell your friends he's just going through a lot. You give him space, then more space, then another chance. And somewhere along the way, you become the person going through the most. That's not love at its healthiest. That's emotional self-neglect. And when you stop reaching out, you finally create space for yourself to ask the question you avoided for too long. How do I feel in this relationship? Not, how does he feel about me? How do I feel? Do I feel secure? Do I feel respected? Do I feel heard? Do I feel appreciated? Do I feel emotionally safe? Do I feel like I can be myself? Do I feel chosen? Those questions matter because a relationship isn't only about whether someone wants you, it's about whether being with them allows you to experience the kind of love you need. You can be wanted and still be mistreated. You can be desired and still be disrespected. You can be missed and still be emotionally neglected. And you can be loved by someone who simply doesn't know how to love you well. That's why your standards cannot be based solely on feelings. Feelings are important, but consistency matters. Communication matters. Respect matters. Accountability matters. Effort matters. And peace matters. Because the right relationship won't require you to lose your peace just to keep someone's attention. So if you're in that place right now where you stopped reaching out and you're wondering what is happening inside his mind, don't spend all your energy imagining his thoughts. You don't need to become a detective of his emotions. Let him reveal them through his actions. Your job is not to monitor his phone. Your job is to rebuild your life. Your job is not to wonder when he'll notice. Your job is to notice yourself. Your job is not to make him afraid of losing you. Your job is to become so grounded in your own worth that you are no longer afraid of losing anyone who refuses to value you. That's where confidence comes from. Not from knowing someone will chase you, from knowing you'll be okay if they don't. And when you reach that point, something changes in the way you love. You stop loving from desperation. You start loving from choice. You stop asking someone to prove you're worthy. You start choosing people who naturally recognize your worth. You stop confusing anxiety with chemistry. You stop confusing inconsistency with mystery. You stop calling emotional unavailability complicated. You stop romanticizing breadcrumbs, and you begin to understand that peace isn't boring. Peace is what love feels like when you don't have to constantly fight for reassurance. Maybe he will reach out. Maybe he won't. Maybe he'll realize what he lost. Maybe he'll move on. But your healing cannot depend on which one happens, because the greatest victory isn't making him miss you. The greatest victory is no longer needing him to. And perhaps that's the real lesson behind stopping yourself from reaching out. You're not trying to disappear from his mind. You're learning how to stop disappearing from your own. You're learning to hear your own voice again. You're learning to trust your instincts again. You're learning that boundaries aren't walls, they're doors with locks. You decide who gets access, and you decide what behavior is acceptable once they're inside. So breathe, put the phone down, let the silence exist. Don't rush to fill it. Sometimes the silence you're afraid of is the exact silence you need to hear your own heart. And if he truly wants you in his life, he knows where to find you. You don't have to chase a person who knows your value. You don't have to convince someone to communicate. You don't have to compete for attention. You don't have to audition for love. And you certainly don't have to shrink yourself to keep someone from leaving, because the right person won't need you to become less powerful so they can feel more comfortable. They'll respect your strength. They'll appreciate your softness. They'll communicate when things get difficult. They'll meet you halfway. And if someone doesn't, then your silence isn't losing them. It's releasing you. And sometimes the most powerful message you can send is the one you never type, not because you're playing a game, but because you finally learned that your peace deserves a place at the table too. And now, this is where the real lesson begins. Because when you stop reaching out, the biggest change isn't always happening in his mind. It's happening in yours. At first, you may have stopped texting because you wanted answers. You wanted to know whether he cared. You wanted to know whether your absence would finally make him realize what your presence meant. But as the days pass, something deeper begins to happen. You start realizing that you don't need to control his reaction anymore. You don't need to wonder whether he's checking his phone. You don't need to imagine whether he's missing your voice. You don't need to analyze every hour of silence, because your healing becomes more important than his curiosity. And that is when you take your power back. Remember this, your value was never created by someone's attention, and it cannot be destroyed by someone's absence. If he reaches out, listen carefully. Don't only listen to his words, watch his consistency, watch his effort, watch whether his behavior has changed. Anyone can say, I miss you, but rebuilding trust requires action. Anyone can say, I've changed, but real change becomes visible over time. Don't let one emotional conversation erase months of confusion. Don't let one lonely night convince you to return to a situation that cost you your peace. And don't mistake his missing you for his being ready for you. Those are two completely different things. Maybe he realizes that he took you for granted. Maybe he realizes that your attention wasn't unlimited. Maybe he finally understands that you weren't going to chase him forever. But whether he realizes it or not, you have to keep moving forward, because your life cannot become a waiting room for someone else's decision. You have dreams that have nothing to do with him. You have a future that existed before him. You have a heart that deserves to feel peaceful again. You have a version of yourself waiting on the other side of this heartbreak. The version that no longer checks the phone every few minutes, no longer questions her worth, no longer accepts inconsistent love just because she's afraid of losing someone. Become that woman. Become the woman who can love deeply without losing herself. Become the woman who can walk away without hatred. Become the woman who understands that boundaries aren't punishment. Become the woman who knows that being alone is better than feeling alone beside someone. And if he comes back, let him meet that woman. Not the woman who was begging for attention. Not the woman who was constantly explaining her feelings. Not the woman who was terrified that if she stopped trying, everything would disappear. Let him meet the woman who finally understands her own value. And if he doesn't come back, let that be okay too. Because sometimes closure doesn't come from a final conversation. Sometimes closure comes from finally accepting what someone's behavior has already told you. You don't need every question answered to move forward. You don't need to know exactly what he was thinking. You don't need to know whether he regrets it. You don't need to know whether he secretly checks your profile. You don't need proof that he misses you. You only need to know what you deserve. And you deserve consistency. You deserve honesty. You deserve communication. You deserve respect. You deserve a love that doesn't make you constantly question whether you're loved. So tonight, if you're tempted to reach out, pause. Take a breath. Ask yourself one simple question. Am I reaching out because this relationship is healthy and mutual, or because I'm afraid of being forgotten? That answer may tell you everything. Because sometimes the person you're afraid of losing is the very person you need to release. And sometimes the silence you think is separating you from him is actually bringing you closer to yourself. Let the silence teach you. Let it teach you patience. Let it teach you emotional discipline. Let it teach you that you don't have to react to every feeling. You can miss someone and still choose yourself. You can love someone and still walk away. You can forgive someone and still maintain your boundary. You can remember the good times without returning to the pain. And most importantly, you can stop reaching out without becoming cold. You don't need revenge. You don't need to make him jealous. You don't need to post things just to get his attention. You don't need to prove that you're doing better. Heal quietly. Grow quietly. Build yourself quietly. Because eventually your life will become louder than your heartbreak. One morning you'll wake up and realize you haven't thought about him yet. One day you'll hear a song that used to hurt and it won't hurt anymore. One day you'll see his name and your heart won't race. And that's when you'll understand. You didn't lose yourself because he left. You found yourself because you finally stopped chasing someone who wasn't walking toward you. So let him wonder, let him choose, let him reveal his intentions. While he is deciding what he wants, you decide what you will accept. And never forget this. The goal was never to make a man chase you. The goal was to become so secure in yourself that you no longer chase anyone who makes you question your worth. Your silence isn't a trick. Your distance isn't revenge. Your boundaries aren't cruelty. Your healing isn't weakness. It's strength. And if he truly belongs in your life, he will have to meet you at the level of love, respect, and consistency you now require. If he can't, keep walking, because the life waiting for you is bigger than the relationship you were afraid to lose. And one day you'll look back and realize that the moment you stopped reaching out wasn't the moment you lost him. It was the moment you finally stopped losing yourself.